Now that you know about whole steps and half steps, let's look at a different way of characterizing musical intervals. This system will let you talk about larger leaps within melodies or chords. So if I were to say F and another F, that's the interval we call a unison. You can also sort of abbreviate it 1, because we're going to call the next note above it a second. So you may say, that's only one step, why do we call it a second? The system is a little bit confusing, but it has to do with wanting to make sure notes are the same in different octaves, which we'll get to in just a minute. But basically the way to keep it straight is to think of one note, the note you're starting on is the first, or is 1, then you're kind of going first, second, or first, skip 1, third note. That's how you can keep it straight. Within this system, we can characterize all of these intervals all the way up to the octave, which is the same note F over again. So we've got a second from F to G, a third, a fourth, F up to B flat, a fifth, a sixth, and then a seventh, back up to F. So we call that an eighth or an octave, and sort of wanting to have that note be the same and be called the octave or the eighth note is one of the reasons that we have this system that can be a little bit counterintuitive, but basically goes tonic or unison or first, if you have to think of it that way, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, or octave. Another way to think of this is to think about the way a scale is put together. Let's use C as an example. Any kind of a scale has to have some kind of a C, some kind of a D, some kind of an E, some kind of an F, and so forth. A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then we start over. So any kind of a scale has to have some kind of a note that is one of those letters. Could be D, let's say, could be D sharp, could be D flat, but you always have to have one of these letters, and moving from letter to letter is always going to be some kind of a second or some kind of a third. For example, D to E is always some kind of a second, even if it might be a minor second or a half step. When that D to E is a whole step, we call it a major second, because that's the interval you find at the bottom of the major chord. When it's a half step, we call it a minor second, because that lowered tone is one of the characteristic things you'll often hear in a minor scale, that lowered scale degree 3. Re, me, re. That's the characteristic interval of the minor scale. So, major second, minor second. And many of the same intervals can then occur in major or minor versions. So for example, major third, minor third. 2 whole steps for a major third, whole step plus a half step for a minor third. Same thing for a sixth, for example. Major sixth or minor sixth. There are also a couple of intervals that we speak of being perfect. They don't have major or minor versions, but instead we talk about a perfect fourth, or a perfect fifth, or a perfect octave. These intervals can exist in augmented or diminished versions, but not in major or minor versions. So if you add a whole step, add a half step, you get an augmented fifth, for example. Perfect fifth becomes augmented, or diminished. You remove a half step. So it's easy to visualize these things on a keyboard, saying we start with this perfect interval, make it a little bigger, it's augmented, make it a little smaller, it's diminished.